I mean, nobody wants to be that girl, but so often we are.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 6 of the Kidlit Craft Podcast. This season, we're doing a deep dive into Kayvion Lewis's YA thriller, Thieves Gambit. Today, we're focusing on introducing a big group of characters. I'm Anne-Marie Stroman, and I write for children and young adults, as well as short stories for adults.
And I'm Erin Nuttall, and I write stories for young adults.
On Kidlit Craft, we look at mentor text to discover the mechanics of how writers do what they do so we can apply it to our own writing. And we are more than just a podcast. Our website has over 400 craft articles. We offer novel writing and revision classes. We also have a live Ask the Author book club coming up this spring, and you can find out more about all of it at kidlitcraft.com. So, Erin, let's start with the big cast of characters. I don't think we need to define any of those terms in our usual vocabulary session, but I have to confess big casts kind of scare me. I'm most comfortable with a main character and a few big side characters and maybe a friend or two. How about you?
As you know, I love to do the big cast of characters. So this was a fun one to break down this book and see how Kayvion Lewis set it up, because you are right to be scared. It can be scary.
There are some tricks.
There are definitely some tricks, because it is really easy to lose your reader in introducing a whole bunch of characters. They don't remember who is who. They don't know them well or at all, so they don't care. And those are kind of the two big issues that you need to look for. Is you need to introduce them in a way that is distinct and give the reader enough to care at least a little bit. Care enough to keep reading, even if they are a tiny bit confused about who is who. Hopefully they're not confused, but, you know, you're not in everybody's brain. So you don't know. But if you can get them to care a little bit, then they'll keep reading and then hopefully get to know your characters better.
Okay, well, we're going to talk in detail about how to do that on the page. But before we get there, what are some of the benefits of having a big cast or a big group of secondary characters who are all in a lot of scenes?
I think there are a lot of benefits. One is that it's fun to see how different kids interact. I personally really like conversations where you have a lot of people playing off each other and responding to each other. I find those really interesting if they're done well.
Those are tricky too.
Yeah, they can be really tricky. And then a big cast gives you a lot of different personalities to explore and a lot of different reactions to explore. If you think about some really popular books in the last handful of years, and there's like One of Us is Lying. You have 5 or 6 kids who are all together a lot. The Thousandth Floor, that one is, again, a big handful of kids, and you really see things from all of their perspectives. Six of Crows is a little older, but oh man, it's a good one for a big cast. Inheritance games, super popular. You've got all those brothers, you got the sisters, you got the friends. Like you have a lot. You have all the bad guys. You got a lot going on there. And it's engaging and it's fun. And especially if you're in a book like Thieves Gambit where everything is cranked up, it makes the characters on par with the story, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. If you just had the 1 or 2 and then you had this massive, I mean, you could do it, obviously, but it's more fun to do it with a lot of kids.
I was thinking of some middle grade examples. So First Rule of Climate Club by Carrie Firestone has a class full of kids. And then Harbor Bee by Jacqueline Woodson also has a group of kids who each tell each other stories.
Oh, right.
So there are a lot of different personalities and perspectives on the world that you get by having more in that group, even though you do still have a central character. And I think all of the examples, or most of the examples, no, some of your examples don't have a central character.
Actually, most of my examples do not.
Yeah, Inheritance Games does, and this one does that we're looking at today.
Yeah. So it is an interesting way you can do it because you don't have to have a main character.
No, but I was thinking of Kekla Magoon's How It Went Down, which is an older book, but that is a multi-point of view character where there's not really a main character. There's an event, and all the different characters experience this event, and we see that event and the aftermath from each of their perspectives. I think there's something like 18.
There's a lot.
I want to say 30 perspectives. I don't know. It's a lot. But it's it's a masterclass in having a huge cast of characters. And it really matters for that book because it's about perspective and witnessing and reliability and how we engage as communities. So it's another one of those things where the choices that she makes really matter to the story itself.
Right. Well, because they all witness a crime, and then to see how every individual responds to that is interesting to explore. So there is that. But yeah, one of us is lying, Thousandth floor, Six of Crows. They all are multi-POV. And in some ways, I really feel like that is an easier way to do a big cast of characters, because each point of view, you get to see the interiority of each character. So even if they're only briefly seen in someone else's point of view, you soon get to see their desire lines, their internal view of the world. And so it is a really common way to handle a big cast of characters. And I think that is why, because you get to really dive deep into each one.
There's a cost, though, too, that when you shift to the reader's attention, there's a little bump. Right. And so if another character's perspective isn't as interesting as the previous character, their attention might flag. So you really have to be careful with that. And in something like Six of Crows, where the world is so expansive and it's this giant fantasy realm, you kind of have to have more than one point of view because you need people to be in different places at different times for all the pieces of the story to come together.
Oh, for sure. Yes. And you're right. There is that risk where you might be like in a character's perspective that you're like, oh, this guy's so boring. So yes, there is that. There's the risk that your character voices aren't differentiated enough. And so you're like, wait, who's talking again? Who are we in again? That's a really tricky one.
We've talked about first person point of view and multiple point of view, each first person, but what about a third person point of view or something omniscient? I was thinking of the Penderwicks, a middle grade novel where there's a very voicey omniscient narrator who feels like a character in the beginning, but then the narrator slips into close third perspective with each of the four Penderwick sisters at different points. So it's still one narrator, but we get that interiority and that internal perspective.
That tends to be a more common thing to do for middle grade than you do for YA. YA tends to be more immediate, more first person, more present tense. One that is super well done is Julie Berry's The Lovely War. So there is a YA one that I can think of that is really well done that has that third person and also has an omniscient narrator. Actually has more than one omniscient narrator. It has the cast of the Roman or maybe Greek gods who are the narrators, and they are omniscient, and they are in the heavens peering down and talking about their favorite characters. And when they do that, they go into really close third for that character. And that was just a really interesting way to do a big cast of characters. But also, most of the big cast was the gods. She only had I guess it was maybe 3 or 4 POVs, but anyway, most of the time for YA, you have first person.
So in this book, we are just in Ross's point of view. And let's look a little bit more closely about how Lewis handles this big cast of character in the Thieves Gambit from this first person point of view. I found the reading experience seamless. Lewis didn't suffer from any of the big pitfalls of this big cast, and she really leaned into the benefits. So talk to us a little bit about how the point of view piece works here.
So first, as we mentioned in our last episode, we get to know Ross first really well. So we have the beginning of the book, we meet Ross, we meet her mom, we understand her life, we understand her desires, and then mom gets kidnapped and her desire shifts a little bit. But we also, well, more than a little bit, her desire shifts from gymnastics camp to saving her mom. But we know and like and trust Ross. And so now once she's in the Gambit, we're introduced to everybody else and we're introduced through her perspective. We believe her. And then it also lets us, as the reader, take a breath to meet these people. It's almost as though we ourselves are in that room meeting those people, right? Because in some ways we become Ross as we're reading and as we're introduced to these people.
Yeah. So we're really talking about this scene where Ross is locked in a room. There are 30 plus locks on the door that she has to pick out of this kind of cell she's in to get into this main room. She was on a flight here, and we find out later that someone she noticed on the flight is one of the competitors in the Gambit. So we have a little introduction early that we don't realize is an introduction. But she gets into the room, and tell us a little bit about this room and kind of how we get to the characters. Does she walk in on all of them at once and give us the rundown? How does this work?
So Ross is expecting to open the door into a dungeon, which I really like. But she doesn't. Or she says a very nice dungeon. It's a windowless room with at least a dozen doors. And then there's armchairs and velvet sofas and everything's, and they're all positioned in a circle. And there's no one else in the room except one person. And the first thing that is, she looks at her, and then Ross narrates Noelia Borchert, as if things couldn't get any worse. And then right after that, Noelia Borchert was the one person on the planet I would have paid money to never see again, which is a great introduction to another character, because now my curiosity is piqued. What's up with Noelia? Why is she the one person on Earth that Ross would never want to see again?
Because, I think it's Borchert.
Aren't you so smart? You can read. Now I feel like my kid, who I'm like, oh, yeah, let me tell you how to actually pronounce that.
I know you would care later. You would be like, why didn't you tell me?
I know. Yeah, no. It's good. But so it's funny what the mind does, because I've read this book and I've read Borchert a million times, and in my mind it's Borchert. So there you go.
I do stuff like that all the time.
So why is Noelia the last person that Ross wants to see? And then here we get a little bit of backstory, which is super nice. And it's the backstory that we talked about in the last episode, which is that Noelia and Ross were good friends when they were little. And then Mom tricks them both into thinking that they betrayed each other, right? And at this point, all they think is the other one betrayed the other one. So we're not surprised to hear that Noelia had been a recurring cockroach that kept crawling into the corners of my life ever since. And we also find out that they have spent the intervening time trying to undermine one another. So we get a very strong introduction to Noelia, which is important because Noelia is one of the most important of the group of Gambit competitors, of this group of characters.
So tell us a little bit about their interaction, right? So we've got, she enters the room, she sees Noelia, we hear her internal thoughts, we get a brief physical description of Noelia, we hear this backstory for the first time, and we find out about the intervening years.
And their first interaction is snarky. They're both a little snarky to each other, but then almost simultaneously, they notice the bottoms of each other's shoes, and they find out that they both like shoes with quirky bottoms, which is not something that ever would have occurred to me that existed. But it's fun that it exists, and that these girls who have a lot of money spend it on shoes with quirky bottoms. And so they see that they have this thing in common, and they're both kind of annoyed.
And it gives us, as readers, this idea that we see the conflict, we understand the backstory and this conflict, but we see this little tiny bit of connection. And it gives us a sense of their relationship, that they're, you know, if you have a villain who is, or a nemesis who's not connected to the main character at all, they're not really a nemesis. There has to be some kind of connection for this antagonistic relationship to work. Right.
And we have the connection that Ross believes Noelia betrayed her. And we have the connection that they actually both have the same taste in shoes. So we have these two opposing forces. So that's like extra nice.
So I really like this idea of just introducing us to the nemesis in isolation right away before giving us all the other characters. Does this seem like an advantage to you?
It does seem like an advantage, as it turns out. Because she turns out to be so important as a nemesis and then later as an ally, it is nice to get the backstory. And then, like I mentioned, the backstory also underlines the trust issues that Ross has. And as a reader, we need to have feelings about Noelia, and preferably the same feelings that Ross has. And so this is a great way to do that.
And I think her being alone in the room is actually really important for this. I know when we were both at VCFA, we heard a lot about pause button violations, right? Where you're in the middle of a scene and you pause to give a lot of backstory or tell a lot of information and then move forward in the scene. And if you had a room with 6 or 8 competitors in it or more than that, and Ross is focused just on Noelia, you're much more likely to have a situation where you're just, okay, everybody freeze so I can, face the audience and tell you all this information, and then we'll go back into the scene. And so by just isolating that she's able to have a conversation. We're not worrying about what else is happening in the room. Lewis doesn't have to use sound to show us that there's a number of people in the room or describe everybody in the room. She keeps us really focused on that relationship by just having Noelia in the room.
Right, for sure. And yeah, you don't have to worry about what conversations are happening around that she's not being privy to. I really like how she has done the setup. Because we are going to meet in a matter of, less than 10 pages, I think, a whole bunch of kids. And yet we as the reader have the time and the space to internalize these characters and to understand their importance in the story.
And Noelia has bested her at the very beginning.
She has, because above each door, the door that they come out of, there is a clock that says how long it took them to get through those 30 locks. And Noelia is not only already there, she's there sitting, legs crossed. So I don't remember what the time difference was, but it was...
That's got to rankle, right?
It does, yeah.
Your frenemy is already beating you at the Gambit, and you are desperate to beat the Gambit. Or win the Gambit. Yeah,
so... For sure, that it is a great introduction to a nemesis and one who plays such an important role.
Okay, so now we have the skinny on Noelia, and the room does not stay empty. Who else does Ross meet, and how?
So the first one who comes in next is, she says, the white boy from my plane flipped his hair back and turned to see the screen above him. And then she does a brief description of him. She says, I hadn't noticed before, but he was wearing dark eyeliner. Unstrapped suspenders swung over his pant legs. It was a casual look. Maybe he was trying to appear casual. Casual people are approachable. So we get his physical description, which is nice, but we also get Ross's interpretation of his physical description, which gives us as the reader something interesting to latch onto. She goes on to expand a little bit more. His accent was standard American, a little bit more about his physical description, and then he fishes a deck of cards out of his pocket. And so now we also have this physical object that becomes part of him as a character. And then she says this, I'd never seen someone so disappointed to not find themselves in immediate danger. He almost seemed annoyed. So he too is expecting a dungeon, maybe a torture chamber of some kind that he had to escape, which is important. She notices his interaction with Noelia. And that is important because we again see the importance of Noelia to Ross. And so right after that, we get a girl and we get a short physical description of her. Everything is the same. We get a short physical description. We get a little bit about her, like Ross attributing a motive to her a little bit. And then we see her interaction with Noelia. And so that is nice because we have the same things happening again with the next person.
Right. And she highlights, too, the American accent. She says, I was pretty sure she was Hindi. So we have the international flavor of the competition in there as well. And we know that she was with Noelia in Switzerland. So we have that kind of international vibe happening. And we also don't have any names yet.
Right. Other than Noelia's, we do not. Which is nice because we actually will get to the names a little bit later. So... there are more kids. We get a very quick description of 4 kids right in a row. 1, 2, 3, 4. Physical description, race, gender, clothing, hair, accessory. And then Ross gives them a nickname, which is helpful because we don't have a proper name, right? Mm-hmm. And we get a personality feature through Ross's perspective. And then I will say I really liked how she did these personality features because she used alliteration, which was like, you know, not required, but she totally did. So she is saucy, smug, smirk, shivered, scramble, scary, scattering, sociopath. And then my favorite, bloodlust. Because if you really want to underline your alliteration, throw in one that isn't. And so we get 4 kids and we follow the same pattern. And so we see them really quickly, right?
Mm-hmm. And it mentioned we get Ross's perspective on these people. And it also, all of these descriptions and what she notices, it's showing us her observational skills too. And this is important to the thieving competition. It's also very nice to have a character that notices things. I've written characters that don't notice a lot, and it's can be very difficult when you're in first person.
Oh, for sure.
That character attribute and that skill that she has is really helpful to Lewis in giving us the lowdown on each of these characters, because Ross would analyze them. She would notice all of these things because of her career and because of her personality.
And they are her competition that she is going to defeat. It is nice when you have those kind of less observant characters. It's tricky to inform the reader while keeping the character in character.
Yeah, it's hard.
We'll have to do another episode on that.
So we had a very long description and encounter with Noelia, and then each new character gets a little less time. Lewis is really being careful with how she's pacing this scene. If she spent the same amount of time with each character, we would get things very long and bogged down, and it would also make each character feel equally important.
And Jansville, right?
Yeah, right. Speed it up, speed it up. We met almost everyone at this point, but there is one more, maybe the best for last.
Yes, for sure. The best for last, in my opinion, as the romantic of the two of us. So Lewis bookends Noelia at the beginning, who is the nemesis, and then Devereaux at the end, who is the romantic interest. And I'll read you the encounters because they're really fun. So the deck of cards is more than just a prop for our American white guy, because he ends up using it as a way to interact with some of the other contestants, and they end up scattering. So Ross decides to help pick up the cards, which was a very calculated move on her part, which I also thought was interesting, but that's a side note. But she says, I leaned over to pick up a card, but another hand reached at the same time. Warm fingers brushed over mine. My head shot up, and I was breathlessly face to face with a new boy. My heart skipped. Another black person, finally. So we get a lot of information in 1, 2, 3 sentences. And we get that, okay, this dude, he could break her heart or win her heart, or, you know, her heart's doing stuff. It's skipping. So
even before she sees him, right? Warm fingers brushing over mine. Like, that gives us like, oh, this is something's happening here. There's chemistry here, even before she sees him.
Yes. I mean, her heart waits to see him because, you know, it doesn't want to waste time if you're not going to be attracted, but for sure. Yeah. And then we get Ross's take, and her take is pretty positive. He's got a British accent. Who doesn't love that? She says he's the sharpest dressed of all, showing off his Rolex, perfectly sponged hair, beyond handsome, and he knew it. But then a little bit of Ross's calculating personality is shown. She says, and used it to his advantage whenever he could. So she is not just giving him a pass because he's so hot. She's still in competitor mode. And in fact, she says, I mentally chided myself. Ross Quest was not going to be that girl who started swooning over the hot guy after 5 minutes. I mean, nobody wants to be that girl, but so often we are.
Denial, denial, denial.
So then Devereaux shows himself to be actually quite a bit different than Ross, because he sees he's last, and he immediately suggests that they tell each other their names and countries. And Ross is like, I'm not here to make friends, right? They all jump on board with this idea. They realize that more information is better than no information. So we have 2.5 pages, so not very long, and we get quite a bit more about each character. We also get their relation to each other and to Ross, you know, where they're from, what their names are. We get a little bit more of Ross's perspective. So what we have initially is we have a physical description and Ross's perspective on them, and maybe like a specific attribute. And that's it. We get very little at the beginning. And then it's a second introduction where we get more. None of it is a lot, except for Noelia and the backstory. But we get enough where we can keep track of the characters, and we can be like, oh, this person is interesting. I want to learn more about them. And that's really what you need to keep people reading when you have a really big cast of characters.
Yeah. And she's made them all very different from each other, too, right? We have the built-in international, that they're going to be from different places and have different accents. And then she makes them personality-wise and characteristics different as well.
Right. And there's race differences, and they are all rich, possibly with the exception of Milo. Because he's, and maybe Teo, because we have a couple who don't come from families. So we have a little bit of that, but they also show their wealth in different ways. And they show what's important to them in different ways. So they're all very unique, which is helpful.
Mm-hmm. And as we've talked about in another episode, we do have situations where they're grouped together in smaller groups. So we get to know some of those characters more than we do the competitors that are working in other groups.
Yes. So it turns out through the rest of the story that there are a handful of kids who gravitate to each other. And much to Ross's dismay, they end up having to work together in groups. It's like on the reality shows where they're like, okay, and now you're going to all build a dress together. And everybody's like, no, I hate working in groups. And that's definitely how Ross felt.
I mean, that's real life too, right?
I know. When your teacher would be like, okay, now let's get into groups. And you're like, great, now I'm doing the work of 4 people.
Well, you are. I'm lazing. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so Lewis has really haloed the 2 most important characters in this intro section, but she's given us enough information about the other characters that we're going to be able to keep track of them. And I think your note about the objects that they have, that's a really helpful, concrete way to connect to character. Mention that object again, and we'll pull up that character in our minds.
Right.
So even if we don't remember them all the way, she's given us things to link back to next time we see the character. And as you mentioned, that 2.5 pages of the second introduction where we find out the names, that just reinforces the people that we've met.
Right. And as you mentioned, this is a great way to do pacing, because it would be really boring if we just had one introduction of each of them and then it was long and they were all the same, right? Like you said. So I don't know about you, but for me, it helps to learn things incrementally. And so to get a little bit and then to be like, okay, I'm good here. All right. And then to get a little bit more and be like, oh, I can build on what I learned before. So I think that's helpful.
Yeah. She's very sure-handed in how she does this. And I feel like, again, I said this at the beginning, it was a seamless reading experience. I didn't feel lost with any of the characters. I was able to follow, and I knew, even by that second introduction, I was like, oh, she's not going to let me forget who these people are. She's not going to make just a random crowd. I'm going to be able to identify these different characters as I go through the story.
I do think that the way she does it gives the reader a lot of trust in her as the author and the writer, that we can rely on her to help us keep track. And that is nice to have as a reader, because sometimes you get a big group and you're like, and you don't know if you want to keep reading or not, because the author hasn't set that up that you trust her as an author, or is so early in the book that you don't know who's important and who's not if you just dropped into a big group of kids. She does a fantastic job. If you're looking to introduce a big group of characters, this is a great book to study.
Awesome. So Erin, what are you taking away from this episode?
I agree with you. It was a seamless reading. And so when we talked about doing this book as a podcast and really taking it apart, I was excited to really pay better attention and see how she introduced us to the big cast. Because like I said, I do like to write a big cast, and it can be really tricky. So I was excited to see that, and I hadn't noticed the second introduction as like a separate piece. I did notice that she had, because of the way I read now, I'm always looking for craft, but I don't always notice everything, especially if the story is really involved and exciting. I hadn't noticed the second introduction, and that is what I think I'm going to take away, is that second introduction is really a helpful piece to reminding the reader of who people are and building on what the reader already knows about the characters. What about you?
Right. Oh, well, I was going to say about yours that, we get them each individually and then we see them interacting as a group, even just for a short time. And that can help to see people in action too, instead of just the static introductions we get at first.
Right. And I do think that that's really helpful, like where Ross is noticing how they interact with Noelia specifically. Mm-hmm. It sets Noelia up as a leader in this group, but it also gives us some of that interacting, because there's people she ignores, there's people that she's like, come be my bestie, and then we see Ross's interpretation of that. So there's a lot going on.
Every page of this book has a lot going on. My thing that I'm taking away kind of goes along with that, where I have this image in my mind of how it's laid out, where we get the bigger part of Noelia and the bigger part of Devereaux at the end, and then all the other people in between, and just how much that halos each of those characters and how important that can be, because it gives us a priority. Just the amount of space given to each character gives a little bit of priority to the characters. It helps us know which ones we should pay more attention to and which ones less at this point in the story, because we have limited capacities in our little brains. And if everyone has equal weight, our brains are going to have trouble with that.
Yeah.
And so that idea of haloing the most important characters and also splitting them up. If it had been Noelia and then Devereaux and then everybody else, it would not have worked.
It's true.
We needed that separation between those two. Yeah, the bookending those characters.
Yeah, for sure. So great. I am so glad when we both learn something and when we learn different things. It's very exciting.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is this episode's cool gadget?
This is, for the second week in a row, less a gadget and more a technique. But last week with the bobby pins, I got interested in this technique because it's in the first chapter and it foreshadows something that happens late in the book. And we'll talk about the later thing next week. I'll save that. But for today, it's this concept of a jigsaw job. So at the start, when Ross is on the initial heist, stuck in the cabinet in the mansion, her job is to get a vase out.
Right.
But her mom's been working this job for weeks. And here is what she says on page 5. She called this a jigsaw job. Piece by piece, she smuggled in shards of a replica and assembled it. For someone as skilled as Mom, switching the real one with the fake was child's play. Unfortunately, the owner was, rightfully, concerned about theft. Security searched the staff each day when they left, Mom's pretending to be a maid. Mom could move the vase around inside the house, but she wasn't going to get it out. That was my job. And so this idea of having kind of a little bit more of like a plan for the heist, right, like a concept of this jigsaw job, is so clever. And especially because she introduces it so early, and then it comes into play so much later in the book. Every time we talk about this book, I'm in awe about how much she has set up in these first few pages of the book.
It is really surprising, like, because you think, oh, this is just some fun heist, and you don't think, well, this is literature, right? But she uses the craft, and that's what makes it such a successful, fun book. Because, we've read books before, everybody has, where it's supposed to be a fun book and you're like, there's just something off. There's something missing. It falls flat. And I think that's the part that is missing and that Thieves Gambit has, is that she uses the tools of literature to make the story be able to bear the weight of the fun.
Absolutely. I love it. I love it. So that's it for today. If you enjoy this podcast, you can find more content like this at kidlitcraft.com, including our new Ask the Author book club and some upcoming classes. You can find us on social media at Kidlit Craft, and you can support this podcast on Patreon. We've also got t-shirts and drinkware and phone cases, and you can find those at Cotton Bureau. We'll have a link in the show notes.
And just an extra little plug for Anne-Marie's classes. Totally sign up for them. If this is something you're interested in, learning more about the craft of writing and how to become a better writer, you could not find a better teacher. She's fantastic.
Thanks.
Well, I just tell the truth, so. Please download episodes, like, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and let your writer friends know about the podcast, or your grandma, or your book club, or whoever you think might enjoy, because we can't wait to nerd out with you.
Thanks for joining us. See you next time.